Her name was Ellen Ainsworth. She was 24 years old, from a town of 1,100 people in western Wisconsin. On the night of February 10th, 1944, when German shells were falling on the Anzio beachhead in their thousands, she chose not to leave her patients. 6 days later, she was dead. Across the Channel in England, a 58-year-old American general who had been quietly sidelined from the invasion of France was beginning to write things in a private diary that would matter. Eventually, in a courtroom none of them would live to see. This is the story of what he wrote, and of what he wrote 10 months later that very few people will tell you about. Both sentences are real. The record holds. February 1944, Anzio, Italy, 40 miles south of Rome. The beachhead measured 10 miles wide and 7 miles deep. Every square foot of it sat within range of German artillery. Allied troops had been clinging to it for 3 weeks, the sea behind them, the Alban Hills in front, and above them, on every clear day, German aircraft came in low across the water. Inside the canvas walls of the 33rd Field Hospital, a red cross had been painted onto the roof, white pigment, the brightest the unit could find, 14 feet across, visible from 2,000 feet. Visible from any altitude a pilot might reasonably approach, a symbol with treaty weight behind it, a symbol that meant, in the language of the Geneva Convention of 1929, signed by Germany, ratified by Germany, that what stood beneath it was not a target. In the second week of February 1944, German bombs fell on the hospital complex. 3 American Army nurses were killed where they stood. Lieutenant Blanche Sigmund, the chief nurse of the unit. Lieutenant Carrie Sheets. Lieutenant Marjorie Morrow. The red cross above them was still smouldering when the bodies were recovered. This is not the story of that single morning. This is the story of what an entire year of mornings like it produced inside the head of one man. A man who in February 1944 had no authority to do anything about it. A man whose career was at that exact moment in disgrace. His name was George Smith Patton Jr. He was 58 years old. And he was about to begin writing things in his diary that would eventually place men in the dock at Dachau. But this is also a story that has to be told carefully. Because the record is not as clean as the channels selling you Patton stories would prefer it. The record is not one nurse and one officer and one famous sentence. The record is dozens of incidents scattered across 2 years of fighting, none of them with the dramatic shape of a movie scene. The record is a pattern. And the pattern is what we are here to look at. Let us begin with Ellen Ainsworth. She was 24 years old. From Glenwood City, Wisconsin, population around 1,100 at the time of her birth. Her parents kept a small farm. She had trained as a nurse in St. Paul at Lutheran Hospital. She joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, shipped to North Africa with the 56th Evacuation Hospital, then to Italy. By February of 1944, she was working surgical wards inside a tent that, like the 33rd Field Hospitals, bore the Red Cross on its roof. On the night of February 10th, while German shells were falling on the beachhead in their thousands, Ainsworth refused to leave her patients. She stayed with them. She moved between cots in the dark, taking pulses, calming the wounded, doing the small steady work of nursing in a building that was, at that hour, indistinguishable from a target. A fragment of shrapnel struck her in the chest. She lived for 6 more days. She died on February 16, 1944, 8 days before her 25th birthday. She was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Among the first American women in history to receive it. Now, here is the first thing you need to understand about the law she died under. The Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armies in the Field, 1929 edition, was not vague, it was not aspirational, it was a treaty. The provisions ran in numbered sequence and they were clear. Medical personnel were not combatants, medical installations were not targets. Markings of the Red Cross, displayed openly, conferred legal protection. Germany had signed the convention. German officers were trained in its provisions. German doctrine on paper acknowledged it. What happened above the canvas roof at Anzio was not ignorance. The pilots had been briefed. They had charts, they had reconnaissance. The red crosses below them were the size of a small house. Whether each individual bomb that fell on a hospital tent was aimed at the cross or merely indifferent to it, the pattern, repeated for weeks across a beachhead the size of a small American county, could not be reconciled with the convention Germany had signed. This is the first thing the record establishes, and it is the thing you should hold on to, because everything that follows turns on it. Now let us go to Sicily. 6 months earlier, August of 1943, in a field hospital tent south of Palermo, a private named Charles Kuhl was being treated for what the medical corps was calling battle fatigue. Today we would call it acute combat stress reaction. A general walked into the tent. The general was Patton. He looked at Kuhl. He asked him what was wrong. Kuhl, in tears, said he could not take it anymore. Patton slapped him across the face with his glove. He called him a coward. He ordered him out of the hospital. A week later, on August 10th, the same scene repeated with a different soldier, Private Paul Bennett, 21 years old. Same diagnosis, same response. Patton slapped him again, this time hard enough to dislodge his helmet liner. He drew his sidearm. He threatened to shoot him for cowardice. Both incidents were reported. Both incidents became public. By the end of 1943, Patton had been formally reprimanded, publicly humiliated, and removed from operational command for the invasion of France. While Eisenhower planned overlord, Patton sat in England commanding an army that did not exist, a deception unit, a man in temporary exile from his own war. Hold both pictures in your mind at the same time, a general who would slap a weeping soldier in a hospital tent. And the same general, 6 months later, reading in his quiet hours about the deaths of American nurses in another hospital tent 1,000 miles away. Both things are true. The record does not let you choose. The Army Nurse Corps in 1944 was the largest contingent of American women ever deployed to a foreign war. Approximately 59,000 women served. Roughly 17,000 of them in the European theatre alone. They worked at every level of the medical chain. Aid stations within range of small arms fire, clearing companies behind the front, field hospitals in the rear. They lived in tents in winter. They operated under blackout conditions, under air raids, under shelling. In June of 1944, Public Law 350 was signed. For the first time in American history, Army nurses were granted full commissioned officer rank. They wore the bars. They earned the pay. They held the authority. And they died, when they died, as officers of the United States Army. Ellen Ainsworth was one of them. There would be others. On August 1st, 1944, George Patton was given his second chance. The United States Third Army was activated under his command in France. He took it through the Avranches Gap. He drove it east across the country in 6 weeks. The advance covered more ground in less time than any sustained mechanized campaign in the history of the United States Army, and then he ran out of fuel. The supply lines could not keep up. The Red Ball Express, the improvised truck convoy that fed the entire American advance, could not deliver enough gasoline to keep his tanks moving. For days at a time, his armor sat cold while the Germans, who had been retreating in panic, used the pause to dig in. Trenches were cut into the fields of Lorraine. Concrete poured into fortifications around Metz. Reinforcements brought up from depots inside the Reich. By November of 1944, the Third Army was no longer the fluid, aggressive force of August. It was a tired army fighting in cold rain across ground that did not move. The mud along the Moselle River froze at night into ridges sharp enough to cut a boot sole. Replacement soldiers arrived at the front with rifles they had fired twice in training. Veterans counted the dead by the platoon, then by the squad, then by the friend they had eaten breakfast with that morning. And the war crimes began to arrive, not all at once, in ones and twos. A medic shot on a stretcher run, a clearly marked ambulance strafed on a road. An aid station shelled after the firing had stopped, a field hospital fired on after dark. The reports came in to the Third Army's Judge Advocate General's office in Nancy, and they were logged slowly into a file that would grow through the winter into something thicker than anyone had anticipated. Patton was running the war. He was making decisions about supply, about reinforcement, about which villages to take and which to bypass, but he was also, in his quiet hours, reading the reports. And what the reports were telling him by November was that the campaign for which he had been given another chance was being fought, in certain sectors, against an enemy that had decided the rules no longer applied. This is where the next part of the story begins, not with a single nurse and a single officer and a single famous sentence. With a JAG file growing thicker in a headquarters outside Nancy, with a general who had slapped 2 of his own soldiers 18 months earlier now sitting down to insist, in writing, that the Geneva Convention be enforced. With the contradictions of an American command that would, in another 6 weeks, look the other way when its own men did the same thing. The record is complicated, the myth is simple. We are here for the record. Ellen Ainsworth's grave is at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, Nettuno, Italy, Plot D, Row 4, Grave 18. The marker gives her name, her rank, her unit, and the date of her death. It does not give her age. It does not say what she did the night the shrapnel struck her. The marker is one small white cross in a field of 7,000 other small white crosses. Hold her in your mind. We will come back to her. November 1944. Nancy, France. Third Army headquarters occupied a former French military barracks in the eastern part of the city. The building had electric heat in some rooms and wood stoves in others. The office of the Judge Advocate General sat on the second floor at the end of a corridor that smelled of pipe tobacco and damp wool. Inside that office, a file was growing. It had begun as a single folder in early October. 3 reports: a medic shot at a stretcher run near the village of Pont-à-Mousson, an ambulance strafed on the road from Luneville, a clearly marked aid station hit by mortar fire after the firing on either side had stopped. By the first week of November, the folder had become 2 folders, by the second week 3. By the end of November, the JAG officers had begun building a separate cabinet. Each report was logged with date, location, unit, witnesses, and where possible, the identity of the German formation responsible. The work was slow, the work was meticulous, the work was being done under a directive that had taken hold in the Third Army's headquarters that autumn. Document everything, document it cleanly. Document it as if a court will eventually read it. The directive came from the top of the command, and the men in the office understood it as permanent. They had served with Patton since Sicily. They knew the difference between his performances and his standing orders. This was a standing order. By December of 1944, the file would contain dozens of separate incidents in the Third Army zone of operations alone, each one a documented violation of the Geneva Convention. Each one a name, sometimes 2 names, sometimes 3, of American soldiers killed in ways the law of war said they were not to be killed. Most of the names in that file are not famous. Most of them you will not find on memorial websites or in the official histories. They are filed under unit designations and date stamps. Sergeant, Company C, 26th Infantry Regiment, Private First Class, Medical Detachment, 95th Infantry Division, Lieutenant, 2nd Battalion Aid Station, 10th Armored Division. They were medics, stretcher bearers, aid station orderlies. Drivers of vehicles marked with red crosses. In some cases, nurses operating at clearing stations close enough to the front that they should not have been there, except that the army needed them and they had gone where they were needed. They had been killed by men who knew what the Red Cross meant. The Lorraine campaign by November was no longer the war anyone had imagined in August. Patton's Third Army had stalled outside the city of Metz, an ancient fortified place sitting astride the Moselle River, ringed with forts that the French had built before the First World War and that the Germans had upgraded since 1940. Fort Driant, Fort Jeanne d'Arc, Fort Saint-Quentin, stone and concrete and steel set into the hills. The Americans had been attacking Metz since late September. They were still attacking it in November. The fighting was being done one farmhouse at a time, one root cellar at a time, one machine gun nest at a time. The casualty rate in some regiments approached the rates of the First World War. 60,000 Third Army soldiers had become casualties since the activation of the army on August 1st. The medical system was carrying weight it had not been designed to carry. Aid stations operated within rifle range of the line. Clearing companies took fire daily. Field hospitals worked through the night under blackout discipline, with surgeons doing amputations by flashlight inside tents where the canvas was wet from condensation and the floor was wet from blood. This was the world the JAG file was documenting. A medic carrying a wounded man on a stretcher across a frozen field, a Red Cross armband visible on his sleeve. A burst of machine gun fire from a German position. The medic dropped. The wounded man dropped. The American unit watching from cover later reported the burst had come from a known emplacement that had been observing the field for hours and had let other movements pass. The shooting was deliberate, it was specific, it was reported. An ambulance running back from a clearing station to a field hospital, white roof. Red cross painted on the hood and on the canvas sides. A German anti-tank gun positioned at a crossroads. The crew waited until the vehicle was within 50 yards. They opened fire with the main gun. The ambulance burned for an hour. 3 patients inside, the driver, the medic, a field hospital tent in a woodlot east of Metz. The red cross on the roof, visible to any pilot flying over. A German artillery battery, miles to the east, registered the coordinates and fired a 5-minute concentration onto the tent. The hospital was destroyed. Soldiers under treatment were killed. 2 nurses were wounded. The battery had no other target in that grid square. These are the kinds of incidents the JAG file held. These are the kinds of incidents Patton was reading about in the operations briefings at his headquarters, and there was something happening inside him as he read them. Something that did not appear in his public persona, something that did not show in the press photographs of him standing in front of his command map with the ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. Something the staff officers around him began to recognize in the late autumn as a kind of cold collecting fury. He was not building it for revenge. The staff understood that. He was building it for a courtroom that did not yet exist. In November of 1944, there was no formal mechanism for prosecuting individual German officers for war crimes. The Allied governments had been discussing such a mechanism since 1942. The London Charter that would create the Nuremberg Tribunal had not yet been drafted. The Dachau trials had not been conceived. The legal framework that would eventually place German officers in dock for the killing of medical personnel did not exist on paper anywhere in the world. It existed only in the file growing on the 2nd floor of the building in Nancy and in the head of the general who had ordered the file kept. On December 16, 1944, in the dark before dawn, German artillery opened fire along an 85-mile front through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. Behind the barrage came 24 German divisions of infantry and armour. The objective was Antwerp. The strategy was to split the American and British armies, recapture the port, and force a negotiated settlement on the Western Front before Soviet armies could finish the job in the east. The Allies called it the Battle of the Bulge. For the first 3 days, the German advance was rapid, and the American command was off balance. Units were overrun. Headquarters were captured. The 106th Infantry Division, 2 of its regiments encircled in the Schnee-Eifel, surrendered roughly 7,000 men, the largest American surrender in the European War. And on the 2nd day of the offensive, at a crossroads in the Belgian Ardennes called Baugnes, near the town of Malmedy, a column from the leading German formation rolled past a captured group of American soldiers. The German formation was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Its commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. He was 29 years old. He had served as personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler before transferring to combat command. He had fought on the Eastern Front. He had been decorated with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. The swords would come 3 weeks later, in January 1945. He was, in the assessment of his own superiors, the most aggressive young armour commander in the Waffen-SS. The captured Americans, mostly from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, had been disarmed and herded into a snow-covered field beside the road. Estimates of their number range from 113 to 120. They stood in rows, they put their hands above their heads, they waited. The killing began without warning. Pistol shots first, from officers walking among the standing men. Then machine guns from the armoured vehicles on the road. The Americans tried to run, most could not. The bodies fell forward into the snow. The fire continued for several minutes. When it stopped, German soldiers moved through the field on foot, finishing the wounded with pistol shots to the head. 84 American prisoners died at Bowness Crossroads on the afternoon of December 17, 1944. A small number, somewhere between 30 and 50, survived by playing dead and crawling away after the German column had moved on. Some of them reached American lines that night. By the morning of December 18th, the report had reached every American headquarters on the front. It reached Patton at his 3rd Army command post that day. His public response was immediate and on the record. He issued orders down the chain of command that the standards of treatment for German prisoners would not change. The Geneva Convention applied. Surrender would be accepted. Prisoners would be processed. Officers who violated this would be subject to discipline. He issued these orders precisely because he understood what was about to happen. A massacre of American prisoners by an SS unit does something to the men who hear about it. It does not produce abstract policy reflection. It produces in the frontline soldier who has lost friends an impulse to do the same thing in return. Patton understood this. Every senior American commander understood it. The question was whether the orders against retaliation would be enforced. They were not. On New Year's Day of 1945, 2 weeks after Malmedy, soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division of the 3rd Army made contact with German forces near a Belgian village called Chenogne, just outside Bastogne. The 11th Armoured was a new formation. It had landed in France only weeks earlier. Most of its men had never been in combat before the Battle of the Bulge. They were green, they were taking casualties they did not understand how to avoid, and they had been briefed, every man of them, on what had happened at Malmedy. The action at Chenogne involved the assault on the village and the surrounding terrain. German soldiers, when they realized the village was lost, attempted to surrender. They came out of buildings with their hands up. They threw down weapons. Some of them were standing in the open with white cloth held above their heads. What happened next was not a single event. It was a series of events spread across several hours and several locations within and around the village. American soldiers, in groups, in 2s and 3s, shot German prisoners. They shot them as they surrendered. They shot them after they had surrendered. They shot them in barns and in courtyards and along the snow-packed road outside the village. The exact number of German soldiers killed at Chenogne in this manner has never been definitively established. The most carefully documented estimates place the number at approximately 60. 3 days later, in his diary entry for January 4, 1945, George Patton wrote about it. The entry runs only a few sentences. It addresses operational matters first, then it touches on the 11th Armoured Division, which Patton characterized as green and as having taken unnecessary casualties. And then, almost in passing, it contains the sentence that has been preserved in the published edition of the Patton Papers, the sentence that is the moral fracture at the center of this story. There were also some unfortunate incidents in the shooting of prisoners. I hope we can conceal this. I hope we can conceal this. The man who in October had ordered the JAG file kept complete, who had insisted, on a question of moral and legal principle, that the record be assembled with care so that German officers responsible for the killing of American medical personnel could be held accountable in a courtroom. The same man, in the same handwriting 3 months later, hoping that a massacre committed by his own soldiers could be hidden from history, he did not write the entry in shame. He did not write it in anger. He wrote it in the practical voice of a senior commander managing a public relations problem. The soldiers were green. The mistakes were unfortunate. The cover-up was operationally desirable. It is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in any American general's wartime record, and it was not Patton's alone. It was a position taken in coordination with the chain of command above him. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, which included 3rd Army, knew about Chenogne. The reports went up. The decisions about whether to open a formal investigation were made at that level and at higher. The records that document the events of January 1st, 1945, at Chenogne were classified. They remained largely outside public view for decades. No American soldier was court-martialed for the killings. No prosecution was opened. No public acknowledgement was made. The legal machinery that George Patton had ordered to be built in Nancy, the careful documentation, the witness statements, the chain of command attributions, all of it would be brought to bear in due course against German officers. The same machinery was not turned against American soldiers when American soldiers did the same thing. This is the part of the story that the title of this video does not tell you. This is the part that does not appear on the channels selling you the famous sentences and the ivory-handled revolvers, the man who said document everything. The man who said the law of war is not optional. The man who said the rules apply also said when his own men crossed the line, I hope we can conceal this. You can hold this against him. You can decide that the cover-up of Chenogne is the more telling fact about George Patton and that the Jag file in Nancy was a performance. You would not be alone in that judgment. Historians have made it. Or you can hold the contradiction as something closer to the truth of what a senior commander actually does in war. A man making moral calculations that are not philosophical but practical, a man who wants the Germans tried for their war crimes because the Germans started this war and conducted it with a brutality that warranted answer. A man who wants his own soldiers protected from the consequences of having been ordered into a fight that had broken them. A man whose principles were real but whose loyalties were also real, and who, when the two came into collision, chose loyalty. The record holds both. We are not here to flatter either side of him. In February of 1945, the Third Army crossed the Sauer River into Germany. In March, it crossed the Rhine. By April, it was driving east through Thuringia, taking small towns by the dozen, finding things in the German countryside that no soldier in any American unit had been prepared to find. The Jag file from Nancy travelled with the headquarters. It went into Germany with the army. It had not yet reached its full weight. The weight that was coming was something else again. And the contradiction at the heart of George Patton's wartime conduct, the contradiction between the man who demanded justice and the man who hoped concealment was possible, was about to be tested by a discovery that did not permit concealment. A discovery that did not permit looking away, a discovery that did not permit finally any human evasion at all. On the morning of April 12, 1945, Patton walked through a gate north of the town of Ohrdruf, Thuringia. What he found there is the third part of this story. April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf, Thuringia, central Germany. The town was small, perhaps 3,000 inhabitants. The road from the town led north through farm country and into a wood. At the edge of the wood, behind a barbed wire fence, stood a complex of low barracks that the local population had been told, for 2 years, was a military installation. What it was a subcamp of Buchenwald. The 4th Armoured Division of the 3rd Army had reached the camp 8 days earlier, on April 4th. They were the first American unit to liberate a Nazi camp on German soil. What they found was not yet what would later be found at Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. The numbers at Ohrdruf were smaller. The horror was no less specific, bodies stacked in a courtyard, the shed where the killings had been finished. The narrow-gauge railway used to bring victims in from the larger camp system, the pit where a few hundred had been thrown. By the morning of April 12th, the camp had been secured. The American command had decided that certain people needed to see it with their own eyes. General Dwight Eisenhower flew in from his headquarters in France. General Omar Bradley came with him. And George Patton, commanding the army that had taken the ground, drove down to meet them. The three generals walked through the camp together. What follows is documented. Eisenhower wrote about it. Bradley wrote about it, Patton wrote about it. The accounts agree on the essential points. Eisenhower's face did not change. He walked the camp in full. He looked at every building, every body, every detail he was shown. He said, in his measured voice, that the world had to be made to see this. He ordered Allied journalists brought in. He ordered film cameras brought in. He ordered American congressmen flown over to bear witness. He said, in a cable to Marshall written that week, that he had walked through deliberately in order to be able to give first-hand evidence if anyone in the future tried to call these things propaganda. Bradley said almost nothing. The photographic record shows his face set in the expression of a man who has decided to be still. Patton walked partway through the camp. Then he turned and walked behind a barn and vomited. He was 59 years old. He had been a soldier for 40 years. He had fought in 2 world wars and a Mexican expedition. He had seen battlefields after the firing. He had walked through field hospitals at the worst hours. He had read the JAG file from Nancy. Nothing in any of it had prepared him for Ohrdruf. He composed himself. He went on through the rest of the inspection. And when it was finished, he gave an order that became one of the most photographed gestures of his entire career. The civilian population of the town of Ohrdruf, he said, would be brought to the camp on foot, every adult, men and women. They would walk the route the prisoners had walked. They would see what had been done in their name on a road they had been pretending led to a military installation. The order was carried out. American MPs marched roughly 1,000 townspeople out from Ohrdruf and through the gate. The mayor of the town and his wife were among them. They were forced to look. They were forced to walk through every part of the camp. That night, the mayor and his wife went home to their house in Ohrdruf. They hanged themselves together. The next morning, in a different part of Germany, in a different file, in a different headquarters, the JAG officers were still cataloguing reports of Geneva Convention violations against American medical personnel. The folder marked Lorraine, 1944. The folder marked Ardennes, 1944. The folder for Ellen Ainsworth, Anzio, 1944. What Patton had walked through at Ohrdruf put all those folders in a different light. Not because the nurse killings were less than what had been done in the camps. Of course they were less. The scale at Ohrdruf was orders of magnitude beyond anything the JAG file had documented in the Third Army Zone. But what Ohrdruf established, in a way no individual report had quite established, was the unity of the conduct. The men who had shelled a marked field hospital outside Metz, the men who had strafed an ambulance on the road from Lunéville, the men who had shot prisoners at Baugnies, and the men who had run the camp at Ohrdruf were not different categories of men. They had served in the same army. They had operated under the same command culture. They had taken the same oath. They had read the same Geneva Convention and decided the same thing about it. The JAG file was not a collection of unrelated incidents. It was a chapter of the same book. The Nuremberg Tribunal opened on November 20th, 1945. 22 major German political and military leaders stood trial in person, with Martin Bormann tried in absentia. The legal framework that had not existed when Patton ordered the JAG file kept in Nancy now existed. Göring, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner. Their cases would be heard for 10 months. 12 of them would be sentenced to death. But the larger machine of accountability was working below Nuremberg in a different American military court at the former concentration camp at Dachau. The Dachau trials ran from November 1945 to August 1948. The United States Army would try hundreds of cases involving more than 1,600 defendants. The killing of American airmen who had bailed out over German territory, the killing of prisoners of war at named locations on named dates, the murders inside concentration camps the American Army had liberated. The Malmedy Massacre trial, formerly docketed as United States versus Valentin Bersin et al., opened at Dachau on May 16, 1946. The lead defendant in court was Joachim Peiper, 73 German defendants in total. The prosecutors put on a case built from survivor testimony, from forensic evidence collected at the Baugnies crossroads, from captured German documents, and from a body of investigative work that resembled, in its methodology, the work that had been done at the JAG office in Nancy. The verdicts were returned on July 16, 1946. 43 of the defendants, including Pieper, were sentenced to death by hanging. 22 received life imprisonment, the rest received lesser sentences. It was, in the categories the prosecutors had set themselves, a successful trial. What followed is the part the official summary does not tell you. In the years after the verdict, defense attorneys raised serious objections about the methods of the pre-trial interrogations at Dachau. Affidavits were produced alleging beatings, mock executions, sleep deprivation. United States Senator Joseph McCarthy, 2 years before he became famous for other reasons, took up the case and pressed for review. The Army convened review boards. The review boards reduced sentences. By 1951, every death sentence imposed at the Malmedy trial had been commuted. Pieper's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. By December of 1956, Joachim Pieper was a free man. He had served roughly 11 years. He moved to France in the 1970s. He lived in a small village called Traves in the Haute-Saône department. On the night of July 13, 1976, his house was set on fire. His body was found in the wreckage. The killing was never officially solved. The justice that George Patton had spent the winter of 1944 ordering documented. The justice the JAG file had been built to support. The justice that had begun in a courtroom at Dachau 18 months after the killings at Bowness Crossroads. That justice was, by 1956, partial. It was incomplete. It was the kind of justice that human institutions actually produce, which is to say something less than what the killings would have warranted, something more than nothing. Patton himself did not see any of it. On December 9, 1945, 3 months before the Nuremberg verdicts, 6 months before the Malmedy trial opened at Dachau, Patton was being driven from his headquarters in Bad Nauheim to a pheasant hunt outside Mannheim. His Cadillac, traveling at low speed, was struck by a US Army truck at an intersection. The impact threw Patton forward against the partition between the front and rear seats. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lived for 12 days in a military hospital in Heidelberg, conscious, in command of his mental faculties. Attended by his wife Beatrice, who had flown over from the United States, he died on the evening of December 21, 1945, at the age of 60. He had outlived VE Day by 7 months and 13 days. He had never seen Joachim Pieper in a courtroom. He had never seen the verdicts. He had never seen the commutations. He was buried, at his own request, among the men of the Third Army at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Hamm. His grave is one white cross among more than 5,000 white crosses. The marker gives his name, his rank, his dates, and his unit. It does not give his contradictions. Here is the contradiction we owe him. In the autumn of 1945, in the weeks before his death, while serving as the military governor of Bavaria, George Patton kept a diary. The entries from September of that year, in particular, were filled with material that does not fit the heroic outline. He wrote about the displaced persons camps that were holding the surviving Jews of Europe. He wrote about the survivors. He used language about them that, when the diaries were edited and published after his death, embarrassed his family and complicated his historical reputation in ways that have not been resolved. He described Jewish survivors in terms that compared them to animals. He resisted the denazification program that was removing former Nazi officials from positions of authority in Bavaria. He drew false equivalences in private between the Nazi Party and American political parties he disliked. These are not interpretations, they are the words in the diary. The diary was published. The words are there. This was the man who had vomited at Ohrdruf 5 months earlier. This was the man who had ordered the JAG file in Nancy. Both things are him. The record holds both. You can decide which weighs more. This story will not decide it for you, but you should know when you hear the famous lines about justice and the ivory-handled revolvers and the cold collecting fury at the news of murdered nurses, that the same man, in private, in his own handwriting, wrote the other things too. He was not a saint, he was not a monster, he was a senior American commander in the worst war in human history, who in the autumn of 1944, in a building in Nancy, insisted that one specific thing be done. He insisted that the record be kept. The record is what we have. The record outlives the contradictions. Ellen Ainsworth's grave is at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, Nettuno, Italy. Plot D, row 4, grave 18. She is 24 years old in the records, and she will always be 24 years old. The Geneva Conventions were rewritten and expanded in 1949, in direct response to what the investigators of 1945 and 1946 had documented. The protection of medical personnel was strengthened, the language was tightened. The signatures were taken again. The treaties are in force in every theatre of war today, and they will be in force tomorrow, and they will be in force whatever new wars come. They are in force because someone wrote it down. They are in force because a JAG office in Nancy, France, in November of 1944 kept the file. Remember the nurse. Remember what the law said she was owed. Remember that in the imperfect, partial, contradictory machinery of human justice, someone made the record, that is the history, not simplified, not flattered, not made easy, the record holds.